Good evening and welcome back to Sunday Evening Devotions. I'd like to continue looking at Matthew's use of the Old Testament as we close chapter 2 with this reference that he uses. We find the reading in verse 19. When Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he arose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, Matthew does not quote or allude to a specific Old Testament prophecy or verse, but rather speaks in the more general way what was spoken by the prophets, plural. And as we think about that, it's more of an allusion than it is a quote. It was John Calvin who referred to Martin Bucer's comment on this particular verse as he thought it was the best illustration or understanding of the reference that Matthew makes. And of course he was referring to the person Samson in the book of Judges, Judges chapter 13, the 5th verse, where Samson's parents are instructed as to the coming birth of the child and how they should treat him, in particular that he would be a Nazirite. And a Nazirite referred to the law in Numbers of a person who was set apart, separated from his brothers, with certain ceremonial restrictions about what he was not to eat and those kinds of things. And so Samson was to be in that regard. Bucer saw Samson as a particular figure of Christ and one who would suffer for God's people, but also be a great deliverer, and certainly Jesus fulfills that. But we can look even farther back and into Genesis chapter 49, where we have the prophecy about Joseph. Joseph was the second youngest of the sons of Jacob. And as we read that passage in Genesis 49 of the blessing that was given to him, we can think of Joseph's story as we find it there. But here is the reading. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of everlasting hills. May they be upon the head of Joseph, and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. Nazir is the word there from which you get Nazirite or Nazarene. It is that root word which means to separate, to put one apart. And certainly we can think of Joseph, who was used by God to preserve his people, as being first set apart by his father's love to him in a very distinct way. He was set apart from his brothers because they sold him into Egypt and separated him from them. Then he was also separate because he went ahead of them to Egypt and prepared a place for him. And we think of Jesus, who fulfills the life of Israel and all these things. Certainly his father's love was upon him. Certainly he was rejected by his own. And yes, he's gone ahead to prepare a place for his own as well. So there's a reference there. And I think, though, that it is the scope of the prophecies. And I think that's what Matthew picks up, is not just a particular verse of the Bible, but the whole of the prophets who spoke of the Messiah, the suffering servant, the one who would come, who would be separated from his own, who would be rejected, who would be living a life of suffering. Certainly that is what Jesus was. And as we think of Nazarites, and we think of Nazarene and Nazareth, Jesus was despised by many because what good thing comes out of Galilee, and especially Nazareth? There was no promise of anyone coming out of Nazareth. He was despised for coming from this backwater town, the place of Nazareth, or the place of little renown. Why was even, one could ask, a descendant of David coming from there or living there? So Jesus lived a life of rejection and suffering. And I think that's what Matthew is doing, is reminding us that the prophet spoke of the Son of God who would come and take on the nature of a man and live a life of rejection and of being despised by his own people. But you see, that is the good news, because his separation for the work that God had given to him, God's great love through him to us, and his dying on the cross and being rejected by the Father in terms of his wrath and justice and us, is all the picture of the good news of the gospel, that by Jesus we're saved. And that is the good news. And that's what Matthew wants us to see. Well, as we think of these verses, I will be taking a break for a little bit here from these Sunday evening devotions. You might want to make a comment, tell me what you think about them. But for now, we'll take a break, and we'll be back at some time, perhaps in the future, to continue our study. But until then, let us remember to rejoice in and to recall to mind the good news of the gospel and share it as we go about our lives for God's glory. Good night.